We start the discussion Ukrainian and NATO for the sake of united and free Europe. Take equipment. The moderator take equipment for translation. Bruno Lete will introduce the participants and he will moderate the discussion. Thank you.
All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being with us here this morning on this discussion about NATO and Ukrainian partnership. My name is Bruno Lete. I'm a senior officer for foreign and security policy at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. On behalf of GMF, let me just say how delighted that we are to be here this morning and also how important we think it is to be here. The events, the developments in Ukraine have not only affected the country itself, but certainly have been a turning point for the entire Euro-Atlantic community. So our discussion today is definitely timely, if I can put it that way. At the very same time, let me also thank our partners in this, because we couldn't have done this alone. The United States mission to NATO for their support, and also the Center for International Studies, who is represented by Mykola here. Without your help on the ground, you know, we are very grateful for that. This conversation is on the record. We're also live on the web right now, so let me also welcome our digital viewers who are watching from behind their computers. We're also live tweeting this discussion, so if you want to contribute on Twitter, please use hashtag NatoGMF, so hashtag NatoGMF. All right, so this is for the brief house rules, if I can put it that way, and let me then also welcome our first speaker this morning for introductory remarks. We had invited Foreign Minister Klimkin, but unfortunately he couldn't make it, but we are very happy to welcome in his stead Mr. Oleksiy Makeev, the political director of the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Ukraine. So thank you for being with us this morning, and the floor is all yours. Thank you. I think.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here and to start this discussion today on Ukraine and NATO relations and the situation in our country. Since February last year, we face Russian aggression, and this is not only Ukraine, which is now fighting for its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is the whole Europe who is rethinking the way how we all face the challenges from Russian Federation to the security of the whole continent and Euro-Atlantic area. It is very important that we start our discussion today on NATO-Ukraine relations after the President of Ukraine yesterday enacted the new strategy, national security strategy, where the NATO is one of the most important elements of securing Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, because last year the Parliament changed Ukrainian legislation and abandoned the so-called non-bloc status of Ukraine. And now Ukrainian security policy is aimed at reaching needed criteria which would enable Ukraine to fulfill all those criteria needed to request NATO membership in the future. And this is a very important element of our strategy. not to request NATO membership here and now, but to prepare. And in order to prepare, we have to reform our country in order to get full compatibility with NATO standards, with NATO armed forces. Thus, we need to reform our security sector. And the next documents, which would be then adopted by the President, would be devoted to reform of the whole security sector in Ukraine. Taking into consideration that Ukrainian citizens support NATO membership of Ukraine, and within the last year we witnessed very high support of this idea by our population. I think that we create all the needed circumstances in order to reform country, to have full backup by our population, and have political consensus within the parliament, within the government, and the president. So this is very important that under these circumstances, Ukraine is going to reform country, is going to make its own contribution to the security of Euro-Atlantic area. And the clear message is that Ukraine would not be a burden to the whole Euro-Atlantic security. It would be an asset. And Ukraine, which would be reformed, prepared, fully compatible, would be a great asset for the Euro-Atlantic security. And this is why the cooperation between Ukraine and NATO, between Ukraine and every single NATO ally is that important. These days in Kiev we have many different conferences and meetings devoted to the NATO-Ukraine cooperation. And I think this is very important that not only specialists and governmental and parliamentary structures are talking about it. We need that everybody here in Ukraine and in the communities of NATO member states know what is happening in Ukraine and why this cooperation is that important to secure Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty and security of the whole Euro-Atlantic area. So I wish all of you good conversation today, and thank you for inviting.
Thank you for your remarks, thank you for your thoughts, and I think you gave us a good tour de table about the issues that are currently at stake, and I also hear you saying that Ukraine is not only fighting on the military front, but also on the socio-economic front, just to reform the country. So I'm sure your ideas and thoughts will serve as good food for thought for the upcoming discussion. On this occasion, let me turn to our panel. I'm actually quite delighted to be surrounded by three exceptional professionals that each in their own capacity come with an impressive record of experience and expertise. My suggestion is that we just have a little conversation on among the panelists first. I will ask you each for maybe some thoughts, some ideas for 10 minutes, and then we can turn for discussion, question and answer. We have until about 12 o'clock, and then I think there's also a bit of time for networking afterwards. We will have a small lunch downstairs. So this for the schedule. Let me first turn to you, Jamie. You are the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO HQ in Brussels. So you've witnessed the developments in this country from a front seat row, if I can put it that way. So if you could perhaps share with us a little bit what the thinking is at HQ in Brussels, how does NATO sees the strategy to deal with the current crisis, security crisis, and what has NATO done so far in terms of offering support to Ukraine? So thanks for that.
Okay, well, let me steal your microphone in order to try to begin to answer those relevant but tough questions. First of all, though, thank you, Bruno, thank you, GMF, and your co-organisers and sponsors. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Totally undeserved, in my case, probably not in the case of my two fellow panelists, but nice to hear all the same. And thank you for also reminding the audience that I have by far the longest and most obscure job title in the entire NATO organisation. But you're right. I mean, I have, as you can imagine, been very closely watching and to some extent involved in some areas at least in the whole effort to address the crisis in and around Crimea in eastern Ukraine and to develop still further NATO-Ukraine relations over the last year and a bit. The first point I'd like to make is that we in NATO understand fully well that Ukraine's security is our security. The more secure, the more democratic, the more stable Ukraine is, the less threat there will be to alliance territory. At the moment, as all of you know, and in reaction to Russia's illegal annexation of the Crimea and its incursions into eastern Ukraine, we have responded with the Readiness Action Plan. And every week, all of you here in this region see, not so far away, NATO forces on reassurance measures, exercising, training, to be ready to defend our territory. In fact, this is our largest military program since the end of the Cold War. But we all know that that defensive task, politically, militarily, financially, will be immeasurably easier if we have over the border an equally stable Ukraine. So our destinies are closely entwined. That's clear. The future of Ukraine, to some degree, is the future of the alliance, and critical for the future of a stable Europe, whole and free. I know this may sound like a somewhat abstract moral point, but I think it's fundamental, and we need to remind ourselves. So in other words, help for Ukraine is not simply a moral duty to help a fellow democratic country in distress, it's also a fundamental security interest of all of the allies. So NATO is committed to the partnership with Ukraine. That's the first point. The second point is that obviously we need to stabilize, to the extent we can, the current situation. Minsk II is not ideal. I don't think anybody would dream of that agreement in a perfect world, but it's the best we have at the moment. In fact, it's the one option that we have, and so obviously we need to make it work. That obviously means that we are, all allies, going to continue very firmly to call on Russia and the separatists in eastern Ukraine to meet all of their commitments. You're all familiar with the litany, but very quickly withdraw the heavy weapons as specified, allow the OSCE to really do its job properly in having access, particularly to the border between Ukraine and Russia, and to monitor the situation. For Russia to stop this obvious infiltration of forces, of personnel, carrying out, we know, intensive training with separatist forces, providing them with ever more sophisticated and therefore dangerous military equipment, such as artillery and armoured combat vehicles. And of course, for Russia and the separatists to allow access to for the humanitarian organizations, given the very difficult economic and humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine. And of course, to fully allow those groups which have been set up as part of Minsk II to deal with security, the humanitarian situation, political situation, economic situation, to play their full role. Obviously, we will call Russia out. We've been doing that already when we pinpoint lies, untruths, falsifications, denial of obvious reality. So although NATO is not a sort of official guarantor of Minsk II, but we are closely supporting the implementation there, because it's obvious that to the extent that the situation is stabilized, Ukraine, Kiev will be more easily able to concentrate on economic reform, restructuring, the debt issues, the reform of the energy sector, all of the other things which are fundamental, of course, for a stable Ukraine in the future. So first, stabilize the current situation. Secondly, we need, and we're doing this, to reinforce quickly our assistance to Kiev. And as my colleague from the Foreign Ministry, the political director, said just a moment ago, virtually every day of the week there is some NATO team, some NATO delegation here, whether it be, for example, a couple of weeks ago to assist Ukraine with cyber defense, where we've set up, under my responsibility, a trust fund, with the support of Romania to help Ukraine improve its resilience, its malware analysis, its training and education in the field of cyber security and defense. That's one area. Another area, it was mentioned, the agreement now on the national security strategy. NATO liaison officers, NATO experts have been in Kiev now for the last year, advising the Ministry of Defense and the National Security Council on the best shape of a realistic, achievable national security strategy that makes the best use of Ukraine's resources vis-à-vis Ukraine's military needs. We hope to start very soon a renewed effort in defense planning with Ukraine in the so-called PARP, the Partnership Planning and Review process, with a new team, so we would be able to establish false goals, false objectives for Ukraine, which we can help monitor. We've got other trust funds, for example, in rehabilitation of military personnel, led by Estonia, in logistics, and, for example, in air monitoring, helping Ukraine with the monitoring of its airspace, because and linking up the monitoring of Ukrainian airspace with the NATO system as well. Also, a trust fund in the area of military career management. We're doing a lot. Another team recently has been working with Ukraine on civil emergency planning, ensuring the resilience of Ukraine's nuclear facilities and the protection, critical infrastructure, particularly pipelines, electrical grids, and so on, based on the experience that we have in the alliance. Another area which I'm also associated with personally is the whole issue of humanitarian demining. This is connected with the current crisis, but it's also a legacy of the past, and dealing with radioactive materials, and also the whole issue of improvised explosive devices and the identification and the clearance of explosive materials, where our experience in Afghanistan obviously I think is of direct relevance here, and we will be assisting. So there's a lot going on. In addition, as all of you know, allies individually are offering considerable support. The United States has deployed for several months at Yavoriv, the training ground in western Ukraine, a whole team training each 8 weeks, 300 Ukrainian military personnel in modern combat operations for resilience. My own country, the United Kingdom, has also sent a team as well. Individual NATO countries, in the spirit of our partnership for peace, have been conducting both on land and sea military exercises also in Ukraine as well. We will not be deterred by the current crisis from carrying out in full all of the activities, both NATO and national, in the annual national program for 2015 that President Poroshenko agreed with the allies back in April. Furthermore, we're stepping up our political consultations. The NATO-Ukraine Commission has never been so busy. It met at the level of foreign ministers a few days ago at Antalya in Turkey, another meeting at defense ministerial level in Brussels at the end of June, so that we can continue to make sure that we identify the needs and that we are fully responsive to how we can help Ukraine most. So there's a lot going on. But the final thing that I'd like to say before at least closing for this opening round is that as we go forward, we need to take not just a technical view of counting or ticking the boxes of various workshops or seminars or activities, but we need to take a much more fundamental strategic view of Ukraine and the future of Ukraine in the European security architecture. What are the elements of that? Well, I mean, the first thing is we must ensure that we don't have any kind of fatigue on either side, with the intensive pace of reform. This is the long haul. Ukraine obviously has been attacked and has been the victim of an aggression. It's also, let's be honest, in a difficult economic situation at the moment, which has not been made any easier by the cost of having to defend its territory, which runs obviously at millions of dollars and euros every month, to pay more for its armed forces, the economic sanctions from Russia, and so on. It's not an easy situation. But we, on both sides, have to realize that we cannot expect miracles overnight. This is going to take time. And the worst thing that could happen would be for the reform effort on the Ukrainian side to slow down as difficulties inevitably accumulate, or on the NATO side, among the allies, for a sense, oh my God, this is taking a long time, there are no quick fixes, there are no miracle solutions, and let's give up. We cannot afford that. We have to stay the course on both sides, which means that we have to implement what we've agreed to do. And the second thing here is that we cannot take a process approach. We cannot take the approach that Ukraine would pretend to reform and we would pretend to help Ukraine. What do I mean by this? I mean that often, you know, in any bureaucracies, national or international, there can be a tendency to say, last year we had 200 extra activities. You know, more visits, more workshops, more seminars, so we must be making more progress. No, not always. Inputs are important, but what we have to do is measure the outputs. We have to be honest with each other. NATO with Ukraine, Ukraine with NATO, to say, hey, this isn't working, you know, this isn't producing results, this isn't the right strategy. We have to have a better sense of what we are producing for our investments, and we have to be honest, as I say, to change strategy if necessary. We cannot take purely an input process driven approach. The next thing is that we must also, as part of this effort of helping Ukraine, not just organize reform activities in Ukraine itself, but integrate and involve Ukraine as much as possible in all of the other things that NATO is doing. Part of that, of course, is operations like Afghanistan, where the ISAF mission has finished, but we've now embarked on a new training mission for the Afghan army called Resolute Support, and where we welcome continuing Ukrainian participation. Ukraine has also in the past sent ships to our missions, counter-terrorism in the Mediterranean or counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden, and that also offers interesting opportunities to maintain interoperability and collective doctrine between NATO and the Ukrainian armed forces. As we now in NATO embark on a very intensive set of training exercises, I mentioned already all of the exercises and deployments under the RAP. For example, this October in Spain and Portugal, we're going to be having a major exercise called Trident Juncture. And the NATO response force is going to be trained and certified. We have also recently launched in the alliance an interoperability platform with 24 key partners, including Ukraine. So it's very important that we don't just see this effort as NATO coming to Kiev, but Kiev also participating more broadly in those things that NATO is currently doing, because, as I say, this is the best way at giving Ukraine access to the most demanding, the most high-level military activities and training that we have. So this, I think, is key. Exercises, maritime exercises in the Black Sea, and all of that as well. Next thing, and I've almost finished, we have to make sure that we coordinate what we are doing with what allies are doing bilaterally to make sure that we don't duplicate or waste our resources. This has to be a comprehensive effort. And finally, and this was referred to by the previous speaker, yes, NATO's door will be open for the future. Ukraine has its place in the European Euro-Atlantic security structures and the architecture. And we have taken note, as was said earlier, of the vote in the Rada some months ago at the turn of the year to reopen the prospect that one day Ukraine can be a member of the alliance. This is not for today. Yes, we all know that. We agree. Ukraine is not ready. We have more urgent priorities in terms of the immediate crisis in the East and the need for reform. But it's very important that the same offer of an open door NATO, which applies to all of the other potential candidate countries in Europe, should also apply to Ukraine. And that vision, even if it's not on the table today, should guide both Ukraine's efforts and our efforts as well. So I certainly endorse what was said just a moment ago. And everything that we do should take us closer to that goal rather than away from that goal as well. You know, we learned after 1989 never to say never, that never to believe that things were impossible in Europe. We must not allow Russia to dictate to us a new normal, a return to 19th century geopolitics, where countries are the victims of their history or their geographical position, or the big countries can dictate to the small countries. You know, Russia often likes to say, you know, new rules or no rules. Well, very sorry, but no to that. We have the rules of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, the freedom of every country to determine its future and its destiny. That is fundamental. Russia, too, has recognized in numerous OSCE and other agreements that right. Russia has signed up to that right. We are not going to go back to might is right in Europe, or I'm big and therefore I can dictate rules especially for me, or I can have spheres of influence and so on. This would be not just bad for Ukraine. Ultimately, if we accept that new normal, if we accommodate to it, we will be undermining our own security as well. And we're mindful of that. So that principle of the right of every country to determine its fate is one that we must not just uphold for ourselves, but for Ukraine as well. Sorry, that was probably a somewhat over-lengthy introduction. I got, as Disraeli once said of Gladstone, over-intoxicated by the exuberance of my own verbosity. But hopefully at least we'll have some food for the debate in a moment. And now I'm going to be very pleased to listen to my fellow panelists. So microphone back to you, Bruno.
Thank you, Jamie. I mean, what's...
Дякую, Джемі. Що мене вражає, те все, що ви сказали, що НАТО, вона була виключно військовим союзом. А далі ми зараз кажемо про реформу, енергетичну безпеку, різну економічну безпеку. Тобто взагалі немає якихось зараз рис військових, може гіперрис якихось. Можливо, ми коли наступного року зберемося у Варшаві, то можна буде провести дискусію стосовно цих подій. У нас наступний спікер – це є Іванна Климпуш-Tsintsadze. Народний депутат України, заступник голови комітету зовнішніх справ Верховної Ради України, голова парламентської делегації України до НАТО. Якщо ви можете трохи поговорити з боку України, тому що Джемі такий огляд зробив гарний, те, чим займається НАТО, які перспективи є. І фактично ми хотіли б дізнатися від вас, що саме бажає Україна від НАТО. Дякую вам, дякую за те, що ви запросили і надали мені можливість виступити тут. Джемі, дякую вам. Найбільш важлива річ, яку я почула, яка мене радує, що НАТО, з вашої точки зору, має стратегічне відношення до України, точку зору стосовно України. І те, що ми іноді відчуваємо тут в Україні, що чого бракує. Ну, я вибачаю за те, що почала з такої критики, але...
More. Well, over this basically almost 25 years of cooperation, of context between Ukraine and NATO, we had our own ups and downs, and we were more and less successful. We have missed opportunities. We have some of the achievements in our cooperation, in our dialogue between Ukraine and NATO. And obviously today, besides the internal factors and internal developments in both sides, in Ukraine and in NATO as such, we have another determinant of our relationship, which is external aggression on Ukraine by Russian Federation. And I think that that aggression makes a clear strategic partnership necessary for the common goal and aim we have of having a peaceful and secure Europe and peaceful and secure life of the citizens of Europe. And that's where I think major strategic interests of Ukraine and NATO coincide. From my perspective, I think few people doubt that unfortunately Putin's plans of destabilizing Ukraine and occupying part of its territory and annexing part of its territory, it's not yet the end of this story. And unfortunately, his activities, or Kremlin activities, are also very much targeted at challenging the unity of Europe within the EU, of transatlantic unity within NATO, and I think all those different okay, how do you call that? Projevi. I cannot see them. Demonstrations of a hybrid warfare that we see right now being used by Russian Federation. This is something that really challenges the already established institutions and structures, even in NATO, who are to deal with the new threats and new challenges, and have to understand whether they have the efficient capability to actually make sure that they are capable of fighting, if needed, this or that particular threat. I think, well, we've already tackled on the fact that Ukraine has come back in its desire and aspiration to put forward as a main foreign policy and security policy priority to get back to Euro-Atlantic integration. And so based on that, we are happy to see, some new developments happening here in Ukraine, and we are very grateful to all those efforts that NATO is trying to make to assist us in this effort. And moreover, I think NATO has been more, in some cases, even more proactive than Ukraine capable of accepting at this or that particular stage. Unfortunately, because we've seen that, the decision on the trust funds has been taken by NATO long ago, back in last fall. Unfortunately, it took, internally here, Ukrainian authorities to prepare the paperwork much longer. I think only by the end of April, with the actual serious push from the Parliament, our executive, our cabinet of ministers has prepared finally the paperwork, the documentation has been signed, but unfortunately, I still cannot find out where exactly is the paperwork right now, because it hasn't been sent to the ratification yet to Verkhovna Rada, to the Parliament. And so that worries me, because I'm sure that all those trust funds, on logistics, on command and control, on rehabilitation of the soldiers, on cybersecurity. This is something really essential for us right now to combat that particular aggression that we are facing. And so, and I also would like to underline that we highly appreciate the engagement of NATO officers, advisors that are stationed additionally right now here in Ukraine. And my feeling is that, again, the executive is underusing this possibility, and there is right now an idea also in the Parliament under the Ukraine-NATO Parliamentary Council to involve them maybe in more activity with the Parliament, and through that actually push the defense and reform that is needed really so badly right now here in Ukraine. So we are seeing our downsides, but at the same time I think that with all these activities, with all this support, with all your stressing that NATO is supporting the implementation of the Minsk process, and NATO does not see military solution to the conflict. We all agree with that. I don't think that that anybody in Ukraine is interested in military solution to the conflict. But however, at the same time, we understand to all our diplomatic, political activities, we have to build serious military capability to withhold the threat. And that is where we are urging NATO to be even more proactive. You were mentioning, Jamie, the trainings held in Yavoriv. Yes, they are there, and they are held by US. We appreciate that, but those are trainings specifically for National Guard, and we need trainings for the armed forces. We need both, right? But we need the training for the armed forces, and maybe having those trainings provided would maybe also take off from the table the question of whether Ukrainians are capable of using effectively the lethal weapons we need so badly, defensive lethal weapons that we need so badly, and then we will be able to handle them very, efficiently if we are provided training. And maybe then there won't be a question. Also, we hear a lot of arguments from outside, from NATO, from our colleagues there, that Ukrainians shouldn't really arm themselves because that would wake up the bear. My only argument to that, the Russian bear, my only argument to that is Ukrainians have not shot one single bullet in Crimea. Did it protect us from the open military aggression in the East? It did not. And therefore, that amount of weaponry, and you know that with the intelligence that definitely is developed on a much higher level in NATO than in Ukraine, unfortunately, at this point. You do know the level of the threat that we are facing right now on the occupied territories of the East that can be very easily switched on, basically, and used against Ukraine. And not only, it can be done in half a year, it can be done in a month, it can be done in 2 years if we will not get rid of all that ammunition, Russian ammunition, trainers, instructors that are right now capably working, unfortunately, on our territory with open border without any monitoring from the international community and without any protection from the Ukrainian side. Yes, we know that the major thing that directs our cooperation today is the annual national plan. Unfortunately, even this year it was adopted, was presented to the president to sign much later than we would like it to see, like 23rd of April, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously we have lost some of the possibilities and opportunities we could have had already, but I want to assure you that right now Parliament is also stepping in trying to assess the efficiency of those activities planned. Unfortunately, they are planned still on a very formalistic basis. They do not really fully represent, and that's, I think, that's the fault of both sides there. They are not reflecting specifically the needs and the changed situation we are finding ourselves in. So maybe that's something that should be corrected and worked more efficiently on in the future, so that these national annual plans would be reflecting and responding to all those needs that we have today. I'm sure we'll get into more details, and thank you.
Ivanna, thank you very much for your honest and straightforward thoughts. And Jamie, I will definitely get back to you shortly, because there are many interesting things that she said, and I will definitely want also your reaction on that. But perhaps first let me turn to our last speaker on the panel. Mykola, you're the executive director of the Center for International Studies here in Kiev. So you've heard both our speakers, contributing with remarks and ideas. How do you see this from your perspective, as the independent expert on the panel? if you could share some thoughts, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. And while listening to the speakers, I reinforced my previous opinion, and just wanted to coin the most critical thing I wanted to say is that there is certainly both a need and an opportunity to deepen cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. And while probably NATO membership is more of a distant perspective, it should be kept on the agenda, and the door for Ukraine in NATO should be open. This would be the best response, joint response from NATO and Ukraine for the revisionist foreign policy demonstrated by Russia. We have been distinctive partners with NATO since 1997, and this was the year when also the big Russian-Ukrainian treaty has been signed, and these were the cornerstones of the regional security architecture since then. And lots has changed. We are currently living in a partly damaged or even ruined European security architecture, and definitely need new responses from Ukraine and NATO, and probably new formats for cooperation. We have been working on the national security strategy since last March, which have been signed by the President yesterday. And the new edition of the strategy carries 25 times of the word NATO being used there. Quite opposite to only twice being used in the previous edition of 2012, which has been signed by then President Viktor Yanukovych. So this is quite symbolic, and this is the sign of how ready Ukraine is to deepen cooperation with NATO. I think that another probably demonstration of that would be the popular support, which goes up to 51% of Ukrainians being now supportive of NATO membership, quite opposite to about 25% in 2009. So we have to take advantage of these new opportunities. From my perspective, given theoretical considerations, like theory of alliances say that there are possibilities for strategic alliance when there is a shared vision, common goals, and compatibility of resources. This is what we are currently having today. In addition to that, we have a common threat, which is different for Ukraine and NATO, because for Ukraine, Russian revisionist foreign policy is a direct threat to its existence, while for NATO, it is kind of more abstract and more long-term risk or threat. But at the same time, definitely, as Jim has already mentioned, for Ukraine and NATO, there is a common interest in having Ukraine strong, democratic, and stable, which is quite opposite to the Russian interests, which the Russian strategy is aimed at having neighborhood quite weak, unstable, and therefore corrupted, and therefore controlled. So we're having all key elements of possible strategic cooperation deeper than the one we used to have since 1997. This is not about Ukraine joining NATO immediately, but this is about bringing cooperation between Ukraine and NATO onto a next level. We still had lots of common experience since 1997, a number of joint operations, number of exercises each year. We have been actively cooperating up until the moment of 2010 when Ukraine adopted this non-bloc status, and then we were back to more technical issues. But the cooperation was there anyway, but now a new situation demands new responses, and there is certainly the floor for more active cooperation. In an article, joint article with you, Bruno, we have elaborated a number of policy recommendations.
Thanks for advertising.
Yeah, you're welcome. And one of the most important from my perspective is having a more clear-cut strategy towards Russia, to which Ukraine could be an element, and having a more extensive dialogue of security structures in Europe, which would involve both NATO, the European Union security structures, national states, and Ukraine as well. By doing that, we will be able to make European security truly indivisible, and by doing that, we will be able to shift from the question of how EU or NATO could help Ukraine to the question what Ukraine and NATO could do together to improve European security. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mykola, for your remarks. And let me perhaps also underline the advertisement. We did write this paper with 6 recommendations to strengthen the NATO-Ukraine partnership. You can download it on the website of the German Marshall Funds. So there you go. Let me get back, actually, well, I will take questions in a moment, but I really feel compelled to get back to the both of you. And maybe first to you, Jamie, because so we heard Ivanna saying, you know, we're grateful for all the help NATO is giving us. Actually, NATO is doing a lot, but perhaps it's not always what we need. Perhaps it's not always enough. I mean, clearly there's also military components to the whole situation. And as we know, of course, you know, opinions are always a little bit divided within the alliance, what the future track is about. So how do you see this? I mean, are we going to do, is NATO going to up its support for Ukraine? Is there going to be a different sort of support in the future? If you could briefly react to what Ivanna said.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bruno. First of all, I totally take the point that we need, it may sound a small point, but it's not. We need on the Ukrainian side to have this legislation passed or adopted by the Rada in order to use the trust funds. For example, in my own area, I mentioned cybersecurity. We have a little issue at the moment where we still need a change to the customs legislation so that the Romanians who are the sponsor of this cyber trust fund can actually give equipment, cyber detection, malware detection equipment and so on to Ukraine. We have managed to raise €1 million initially for the trust fund. And of course, we don't want to deter allies from contributing money, and we know that everywhere, not just in Ukraine, but everywhere, money is tight at the moment. It's not easy to get governments to donate. And so at a time when the trust funds have shown some degree of interest by allies, they've donated. The key thing now is to send a message that Ukraine is doing what's necessary to take full advantage. That's critical, particularly when we have to restock the money next year and the year afterwards. So I'm very grateful what you said about yourself and personally and the Rada pressing where necessary the authorities on this issue, because as I say, we need to keep the momentum having established it. Another thing, of course, which is key is stability of personnel. Now, I'm the first person to acknowledge that sometimes you need to replace a less competent person with a more competent person. It probably will happen to me eventually as well. But one thing which is very important for defence reform, all jokes aside, is having a team in place, both on our side, of course, and on the Ukrainian side, which lasts. The collective memory, the personal contacts, the engagement, and we've frankly have had a lot of different people very quickly, and then you have to start the process again. So certainly not just the legislation, but the stability in personnel, I think would help as well. I think the third thing, of course, is a sense of realism in defence reform. Resources are limited. And what NATO can do, I think, is to help you to identify, based on the experience of a lot of allies who also in the last years have been through the process of defence reform, painful about reductions in the size of armed forces, professionalisation, investment choices, organisation, is to choose the thing that is most cost effective for you. I mean, in the past, we've had enormous ambitions and not enough implementation. That doesn't give the process credibility. So we need to come up with something which makes sense for you, but which is doable and achievable within the budgetary resources. That's crystal clear. We need, to some degree, to also do what we say we're going to do before we go to the next stage. I think also in the past, one of the lessons that we've learned in defence reform was there was a tendency to, want the declarations, want the big political statements, always go to the next step, but without the concrete work following. That's not sustainable in the long run. So it's better to be maybe a little bit less ambitious but achieve than to have, as I say, big ambitions which are then constantly being modified. So I think on both sides, given, as you rightly say, our cooperation goes back to the last century, the 1990s, on both sides we've learned lessons on how to do defence reform and how not to do defence reform. And given now the much more complicated geopolitical situation, it's important that we don't repeat those mistakes. You know, the margin of error is far less than what it used to be. So that's the first thing. The second thing, when it comes to the issue of allied support, well, it's obviously, and I know this may sound like a bureaucratic answer, Bruno, but it's the honest answer. You know, NATO does not have weapons. We don't. I mean, it's our nations that have the equipment and the armies. In NATO headquarters, I guarantee you there's, forgive me, but there's no sort of cupboard at the end of the corridor where if you have the key, you open it up, there's a lot of fancy weaponry and equipment. We really don't have that. It's up to the nations to decide on that. Many of them, however, you know, beyond this issue which was raised of lethal weapons, non-lethal weapons, many, the United States and others, have given a considerable amount of equipment to Ukraine. I mean, the United States, I think this year, if I remember, has budgeted about $115 million for various types of equipment. And because we may talk about non-lethal, you may get the impression that somehow this equipment is not relevant or is less valuable. I strongly would reject that. This is about, you know, air defense, it's about radar, it's about communications, secure communications equipment, it's about night vision. Sort of, these are things which really do help the Ukrainian forces to defend their territory. But as I said before, this is something where clearly the allies are in the lead and not NATO. I mean, what we have to offer, frankly, is brain power, if I could use that somewhat arrogant term, rather than muscle. I mean by that it's the expertise of advising on military restructuring, defence reform, goals, training, and the rest. But the hard equipment obviously has to come from the individual allied nations. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. And you know, maybe also one follow-up question with you, Ivanna, if I may. It's also about Ukraine's capacity to absorb all the supports that NATO gives, even if it gives more. But to absorb support, you of course need, you know, transparent structures, clear processes. While today perhaps there are still, you know, some few problems with, you know, flawed legislation or non-transparent structure, etc. So even if NATO would give more support, can Ukraine absorb it? I mean, and are we making actually progress on this reform side?
Thank you, Bruno. May I just, before answering
Sure.
To your question, get back to some of the comments of my colleagues here. Would be terrific if this brain power could be used to encourage the allies, you know, to take the lead in the right direction. That's something that, you know, that could be done, I think. But that's more of a joke. But along those lines, I think it's very important to actually keep in mind all those official promises that have been made back in Bucharest to Ukraine, and, you know, and work also on along those lines. I would believe so. I do understand the situation was different at that point geopolitically, and we obviously are facing totally different situation. But still, there is seems that there is some caution in repeating that message, so to say, to Ukraine, understanding very clearly that Ukraine right now is A, not ready, B, not going to file a NATO, you know, membership application or anything like that. But that's something of a specific signal of understanding and support. With regard to the absorption capacity of Ukrainian armed forces and defense sector as such, well, I think that everybody would agree that it's growing very quickly, that armed forces we had a year ago and armed forces we have now, these are two different armies, two different, you know, capable bodies, basically. And unfortunately, with such a high price of losing a lot of human life and losing a lot of wounded soldiers, basically we are learning on the way. But I think with all these processes that have been going on with a really clear war with the basically Russian Federation, or also separatists backed and supported by Russian Federation, through that hard experience, we are much more capable today to absorb. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to learn more and more in that and be capable to absorb more. And finally, I think that Ukraine is getting to that point that it's getting more capable of formulating exact needs of hers, because it seems to me that previously it was, okay, here's something on the table from NATO, yes, we probably need it. So I think finally we have some spots and some teams in the ministries that would hopefully stay there to preserve the institutional memory, to work further and to accept and formulate the needs in order to get to that defense capability that would need to correspond to the national security strategy and hopefully to the review that will be on the table in the nearest future. And one more thing on what Mykola was saying with regard to the direct threat Ukraine is facing, and maybe indirect threat, in your words, that NATO is facing. We have kind of touched a little bit upon that, but I think the direct threat, not only NATO, but the world is facing, is the whole possible review of the universal security system as such. And that's totally other level of, cooperation and communication and work. But that's something that I think is clearly going to be a result of this whole conflict around Ukraine.
Mykola, you want to say a few words?
I have a quick reaction to Ivanna's words about the threatening of international security system. That is definitely correct. I agree with that, and I heard that from the words of Jim that NATO do understand that the kind of a risk which the whole global security architecture is facing. That's what you deal with when you face a revisionist power, which is trying to break the rules or to change them by force. This is certainly a threat which is common for the whole region at minimum. Another thing I wanted to quickly react to is Bruno's notion about the capability to absorb international assistance. From my perspective, it's a very important point, and it goes well beyond the issues of assistance from NATO, because I do believe that one of the fundamental reasons for the Maidan here in Kiev was the weakness and ineffectiveness of the Ukrainian state. And we're currently sitting in a very historical place where all these things took place. And weak states are unable, one of their weaknesses is being unable even to absorb financial, technical, or any other assistance they get. There was a study, I don't remember, last year probably, about the experience of international assistance to Iraq, which received huge amounts of money, but being a weak state was unable to absorb it. Just about 60% of international financial aid which flowed into Iraq was effectively used. We are facing the same problem, and this is a more general one than only absorbing assistance from NATO. Thanks.
Jamie, you have one last pressing thought, and then we'll turn to questions.
No, thanks very much, because I didn't talk about this other issue called about the threat, as it were, and what Ivanna was saying. I would characterize it the following way. Obviously, we are in the alliance in a situation where our own territory has not been attacked, and we hadn't so far had to defend it, but we are determined that if we have to do it, we will be able to do so effectively. That's the Readiness Action Plan. But even if Ukraine, of course, has been attacked and NATO has not, we still share a common sense of alarm about what has happened over the last 18 months. The first thing, of course, is that we in NATO are now subject to a very high intensity of Russian military activity on land, at sea, in the air, near our borders, very close to our airspace, just off our coasts, virtually every week. This week, we're confronted with another unannounced, non-transparent snap exercise, involving 80,000 plus troops, the sort of thing that we haven't seen in Europe since the 1970s or the early 1980s. And this is worrying at a time when the mechanisms that we had to regulate that, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the so-called Vienna document. I know this sounds a bit technical, but this is very important. These arms control treaties, which provided for data exchange, mutual inspections, transparency. These instruments aren't working the way they used to. So when a great power on your border with a lot of military forces and nuclear weapons starts to behave in a very unpredictable way, of course it creates a great deal of unease, as you can well imagine. When the Secretary General of NATO met Minister Lavrov in Brussels last week, he handed him a schedule of all of NATO's military exercises, saying, look, we're going to continue to keep the rules. We're going to be transparent. Here's our schedule. We invite Russian observers to come once again to observe what we're doing so that you can see that it's wholly defensive. So on your side, please do the same. Show the same degree of transparency, especially if we're ever going to re-establish trust in the future. The second thing I think that we find worrying, and this has been referred to already, is a great power not only sort of uses military force in its neighborhood, but just breaks all of the international agreements and treaties. Particularly, remember the Budapest Memorandum of the 1990s, when Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine at the time. And again, if, a great power suddenly says, hey, the rules don't apply to us, or, we don't believe because we're powerful that we need to respect them, that sets a bad precedent for everybody else around the world who thinks, well, it's now a free-for-all and we can do the same. So this has implications way beyond Crimea. Thirdly, and I'm sorry to be a bit lengthy on this though, Bruno, but this is important. What also worries us is at a time when Russia is under sanctions, economic difficulties, inflation, and the rest, a decrease in the standard of living, and it has pressing problems, health, higher education, pensions, and so on. It devotes more and more of its resources to modernizing its military forces. This year, 50 new nuclear weapons will be deployed, 200 new military aircraft, for example. You saw the May Day parade in Moscow, which was just like out of the old Soviet times. So this was not a commemoration of World War II. This was not looking back to the past. This was an affirmation of present-day future power, which to my mind had very little to do with World War II commemorations. And so, at a time when for many years we were trying to decrease military forces in Europe, have less, Russia is now going the other way. So, you don't necessarily have to have the same thing, God forbid, happen to a NATO country as tragically happened to Ukraine. You don't need the same thing to cause an equal sense of disquiet and concern in the NATO countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie, and I'm happy that you underscored actually the importance of the elements you just mentioned around Russia, so please take your time. Questions, the floor is open. We have plenty of time. Please, ask your, challenging questions, pressing thoughts. The only thing I would ask is just to introduce yourself before you ask your question. I already see 2 hands, one there and one there.
Please put all questions in the microphone. Thank you.
Sergei Sidorenko, European Pravda. I have a question probably to Jamie Shea, first of all. Firstly, I would like you to specify, you mentioned about the problems we supply to Ukraine some equipment that is, as far as I understand, bought according to NATO Trust Fund's obligations. So is that about duties that have to be collected from that equipment? So what is the problem? Could you explain that? And another issue I want you to comment is about an idea of Ukraine to have a NATO support or NATO assistance in fighting or countering Russian propaganda. That idea was discussed briefly in Antalya 2 weeks ago, like that. But as far as I understand, it was not approved. So do you see any problems? Do you see any progress? And when could it be adopted? Thank you very much.
Okay, why don't we just take the question now? And
sorry to do all the talking. I promise I'll shut up and others can do the talking, because they've probably got far more interesting things to say than me. But thank you for the two questions, and good to see you again here. On the first one, these are, as I mentioned, simply sort of bureaucratic formalities that any country has to comply with. And it concerns customs clearance for equipment, VAT exoneration. It's obvious that, you know, if you're transferring equipment and you don't have to pay customs fees or VAT, you can supply more equipment. It's as easy as that. You know, you get more value for your money. But this is being dealt with. It's not that Ukraine is not doing this, as Ivanna rightly said. It's just the quicker the formalities are complied with, the quicker we can supply the equipment and the training and technical support for the installation of the equipment. First point. Second point, Stratcom, we are doing something. We've had a NATO-Ukraine team working on this, because we ourselves in the alliance have identified strategic communications, fighting the Russian propaganda, not with propaganda, but with factual, accurate information that exposes lies quickly and therefore undermines the credibility of this Russian narrative. That's something which we are working on ourselves. With Ukraine, my colleagues in the public diplomacy division, as I've said, have carried out a lot of different activities here. This also is in a larger context, which we haven't really mentioned yet, called hybrid warfare, where we need to understand, particularly based on Ukraine's terrible experience last March, we need to understand how hybrid warfare happens. How can one state destabilize another state, particularly by playing in the media information field? Are your vulnerabilities our vulnerabilities, for example? How can we help you to be less vulnerable to those kind of manipulations in the future? So it's not just strategic communications, it's part of the broader exchange of views on sort of the sort of hybrid warfare below the level of a major conventional attack, where you try to paralyze a state through all kinds of different sort of infiltration, sabotage and other tactics. But we are working on the Stratcom piece. Thank you.
Please into the microphone.
There may well be a trust fund on this, with Turkey having shown some interest in supporting it. Yes. Sorry, I should have answered the question.
all right, thank you. Please. Question from.
Thanks a lot. Hanna Shelest, political expert, Odessa. The question is both to Ivanna and to Jim. As we already had the partnership since 1997 with all the support to security sector reform of the trust funds that we had on special issues with the trainings, etc. Have it been made any work on the mistakes, and what mistakes were learned from the previous experience? Because we used to speak that the problems were in Ukrainian corruption, laziness, or foreign agents in the Ministry of Defense, but also sometimes it looked that NATO itself was like a rich parent who doesn't have time for the child, who's just giving money and not caring how the process is going on. That very often this support was given without the real control of of the effectiveness. So were from both sides any kind of work and mistakes made to understand what was the real problems, that the previous partnership was not that effective, that both sides would like to see it now, so to prevent of repeating them in the current cooperation?
Ivanna, I think this is for you.
I would like to, that type of work on mistakes being done more in a systemic and really comprehensive manner. My understanding is that such, systemic and comprehensive learning process has not taken place yet here in Ukraine. I don't know about NATO assessment of the mistakes, so maybe Jamie would add something to that. I think that what is right now very important, that we, by doing this defense planning, that review that we are to do, this is something that should, from my perspective and my understanding, incorporate those mistakes that have been made and or those deficiencies that have been put in the programs previously. Also, I think part of the, okay, if we can say mistake, would be the shift we had in the Ukrainian policy on where did we have the, the priority of NATO-Ukraine cooperation and how we saw it and how we actually, so implementation was coming from the political will and political understanding of the necessity or importance of this cooperation. And over these years of independence, unfortunately, we had most of the periods where kind of not very clear in our, aspirations, in our understanding of what we want to achieve. So we kind of tried to, during a lot of years, a decade basically, we tried to cooperate both with NATO, with the Russian Federation on the same level, or even, more with the Russian Federation. We did not, and I think it was also the, the NATO approach that all the partners had to be incorporated basically in some cooperation structures, in some cooperation activities, so it wasn't necessarily that much of the interoperability with NATO forces, but it was about also interoperability with all the partner nations during the partnership for, through the Partnership for Peace or through the national annual programs or through the even plans of actions for the NATO membership. So I think it's also, the policy thing, maybe not that many mistakes, but there were not that many ambitions really clearly stated and reflected in the plans that were developed for each year.
Thank you. Mykola, you want to have a go?
Well, just very briefly on the mistakes part, but I'll defer to perhaps my colleague first, because fair's fair in terms of equal time.
I'll get back to you, Jamie.
Right.
I will be very short, and I would probably develop a little bit Ivanna's idea that Ukraine's foreign policy was not sustainable, and we were using the negotiations with NATO and with the European Union as well as a leverage within our relations with the Russian Federation. And to build that sustainability is critical for developing any long-term cooperation, strategic partnership with NATO as well. And again, by getting back to effectiveness, talks about corruption and things which are not fixed in Ukraine are not just talks, because they are considerably lowering the way we can effectively use our cooperation. And that is certainly what we have to do in order to build up a strategic approach to cooperation with NATO or with the European Union or, in fact, with any other strategic partner.
Thanks.
Well, thanks again for the question and also for the comments. From a NATO perspective, of course, all institutions make mistakes. It's unfortunately, but true, it's inherent sort of in the human predicament. The key thing is to identify those mistakes quickly and not just sort of learn them, but implement the improvements. As you know, the libraries of all of our countries are full of lessons learned papers, but were not implemented. So it's important to learn them and implement them. Now, I mentioned a few. I mean, maybe too much emphasis on, activities and shopping lists, and not enough metrics and benchmarks for accurately measuring, is this working, are we succeeding? How do we know if all of this training is having an effect in producing a more capable force? How can we test this? So we've got to be, as I say, more realistic and more honest in looking at the results, number one. Number two, I think maybe we needed a stronger presence in Kiev, because military reform requires, not just one or two liaison officers, but a whole team. And that is something that we are now, as I mentioned, we've now done with a much stronger permanent NATO presence here, so more continuity. Maybe also, sometimes, as always, one side expects the other to take the initiative, so we're waiting for Kiev, and meanwhile Kiev is waiting for NATO, and there's a little bit of a dialogue of the deaf. The other side is, the ball is always in the court of the other side. I think now we recognise in NATO that we have to push Kiev. Yes. Absolutely. I mentioned the trust funds, and even if your partner is a willing partner, sometimes they also need to be pushed, and we shouldn't just sort of sit back saying, here's the menu of activities. Come and talk to us when you're serious. No, it's too important for that. Ukraine is going to push NATO. We heard that already, rightly so. And among friends, close friends, it's legitimate to push each other, and I think that's a lesson we've learned as well. The other thing I think I mentioned too is maybe in the past having over-ambitious programs which could not be implemented. But the other thing is that there's been a bit of a tendency in the past for Ukraine maybe to say, give us the status and then we'll do the reform. I have this with my children, who always say, Dad, give me the 50 euros and then I'll wash your car. I was like, wait a minute, you did that to me last weekend. I gave you the 50 euros, the car was never washed. No, this time round, you wash the car, then it's an obvious point, but there's this point, give us the status, the special status, and that will incentivize us to do the reform. And then, the status is given, the reform doesn't happen. And I think now we've got, honestly, with each other to say, no, credibility is, first of all, do it, perform, establish a track record of seriousness, and then we could talk about, upgraded status and so on. It's not easy, because it's always the question of the carrot and the stick here. What incentivizes effort? But it's obvious that given the present juncture, we need to concentrate above all on pragmatic, technical things in the military domain that really do improve Ukraine's defense capability. That's absolutely crucial. The time for status will come, but it's for tomorrow, not so much for today.
Thanks, Jamie. Are there more questions? Oh. Yes,
I'm Denis Vasilyev, Reanimation Package of Reform, Defense Group. I have questions for you, James. From 2002, Ukraine and NATO have an action plan. And how do you feel, what you mind about last year? Do we have progress of realization of this plan that we have with NATO? And do we reach any proposals that we have in this plan?
I'm sorry, last year, that was the only year when Ukraine didn't have any approved plan between Ukraine and NATO on 2014 because of all the disturbances that were going on and the situation which was going on. So I'm sorry, it was a question to Jamie, but there was no plan that was approved, agreed, and had to be carried out. Unfortunately, that was in 2014.
Mykola from Ukrainian Daily The Day. I have two short maybe questions. Concerning sustainability in foreign policy, don't you think that Ukrainians need to carry some referendum of NATO that to show that all people, all Ukrainian is wishing to join NATO? Because we have many examples when some kind of letter was signed, or Tymoshenko was forced to sign letter to apply, apply for membership of NATO. And the second question concerning Shea, Mr. Shea. You maybe remember, maybe months ago, Stoltenberg was in Washington, but Obama has not accepted him. Stoltenberg was for a couple of days there. But now, yesterday, already they have a meeting, and we heard from Obama that Russia become more aggressive towards Ukraine. What such kind of signal do you see can show to the world? That Russia is more aggressive to Ukraine, and NATO may be helping doing some help. So what should be signal from Obama as leader of NATO towards aggressive of NATO? Where there should be this red line? When new sanction or some new action would be done to remove Russia, to reverse Russia actions in Ukraine. Thanks.
All right, thank you for your question. So perhaps first, Ivanna, on the need for, or the potential need for a referendum, and then Jamie, I will turn to you for the second question.
I think you've heard also from the president of Ukraine that he mentioned just recently that referendum on support of the NATO membership could be held here in Ukraine. Whether it has to be done in the nearest months or so, I don't think so. I really think we have a lot of homework to deliver, you know, and it's in our own interest to actually perform, as well Jamie was saying, you know, to set a track record of seriousness. I think we are very serious, but we have to, for ourselves, to prove this to ourselves, not for NATO, not for anybody, for any outside audiences, and understand clearly what, you know, what are the gaps that we still have to fill in before applying for NATO membership. Also, if we hold the referendum now and not apply immediately after that, that could be a wrong signal to the society right now. So I think we have to be a little bit more prepared to apply. And at the same time, we see that the support is growing, and we have, for the first time, I think, since Ukraine's independence, we have more than 50% supporting NATO membership, according to the polls.
Just on the referendum, obviously, and as Ivanna rightly pointed out, this is something for Ukraine itself to decide. It's not for NATO. Different countries have different constitutional procedures. We've had a whole series of referenda on NATO membership. There was one in Spain, way back in the 1980s, in the Czech Republic, when that country joined the alliance. Another one in Slovenia, which was also combined with the EU membership. So different countries do it in different ways, but normally it, as you rightly point out, it takes place, you know, when the negotiations have taken place and the country is on the verge of actually joining the alliance. I've no doubt that whereas, you know, Mr. Putin is against NATO enlargement, but his actions have the opposite effect. It was like President Yeltsin back in the 90s warning the countries of Central and Eastern Europe of the consequences if they wished to join NATO. The impact was that it pushed them into the arms of NATO. They became even more determined to be part of the West when they perceived that Russia was hostile. So I've no doubt that this 50% is directly connected with Russia's aggression, although I would hope also that it was in part because Ukrainians understand that NATO is a friend and a partner, and that we share the same values. So that's for referenda. On the second part of your question, first of all, it's normal that it can take a while sometimes to get a date to meet the President of the United States, but the Secretary General is also a very busy man. I know because I work for him, and they've had several telephone conversations and several previous meetings. But you are right, yesterday the Secretary General was in the White House. I mean, it's not for me to interpret President Obama's remarks. I used to be the spokesman of NATO, but I've never been the spokesman of the White House, so I'll leave that to Josh Earnest, the President's spokesman. But what I sense is behind those remarks is, first of all, as I said, we are vigilant regarding what Russia is doing. We hear the words of Mr. Putin, but we see actions that point in a very different direction. And we have learned, particularly with the Russian leader, that it's actions that matter, not words. So, as I said, we will call Russia out when we see a pattern of behavior which is contrary to the declarations and which remains fundamentally aggressive. Secondly, we have in NATO, as you know, frozen our cooperation with Russia. The NATO-Russia Council has not met for a long, long time, although we keep at the high political level, Secretary General Lavrov, our military commanders, the hotline, we keep communication open because it's very important, particularly with a less predictable Russia, to have some kind of channel of communication. But when it comes to the fundamentals, we are not going to accept the new normal. We are not going to accept, that suddenly, what's happened in Crimea is acceptable, it's the new normal, we have to accommodate to it, we go back, after a decent period to business as usual with Russia. No, the sanctions are there. US sanctions, EU sanctions, other international sanctions, the freezing of the NATO-Russia relationship. I think, to be honest with you, a lot of Russian diplomats, when they spoke to me after Crimea, said, it's going to be just like Georgia in 2008. You guys will sort of huff and puff for a few days, you'll protest, but then very quickly you'll accept all of this, and we're too important not to have a relationship with, and we'll go back to business as usual. And I generally think that many Russians have been surprised that more than a year later the sanctions are still in place, the NATO actions are still in place. The sense of strong feeling, again, that this is about Ukraine, but it's not just about Ukraine. This is also a fundamental turning point for the kind of world we're going to live in the 21st century. And the Putin vision is not the vision we want. It's not good for Russians, and it's certainly not good for us. And that therefore, if we believe in something, this is the time to take a stand. I mean, I often like to quote Winston Churchill once, and one of his aides sort of was complaining that he'd been criticised. And Churchill said, "What are you worried about? For once in your life, you stood up for something." And that's what we have to do as well.
Thank you. You want to give a short reaction?
That was a very motivating speech from Jimmy, and just great to hear that. I had a quick remark about the referendum. I'm sure that this could be a symbolic act and of inner Ukrainian politics, internal politics. But in order to build up relations with NATO, we have to concentrate on more important things. And this is a military alliance. We have to become a contributor to security. Not only a country which consumes it. This will be much more important than holding a referendum on the issue.
All right, thank you. I see a question, and then the gentleman in the middle row.
George Bokuchava, the student of the Institute of International Relations. It's a great pleasure and privilege to me to be here at this event, and I would like to pose two questions, especially to Mr. Jamie Shea. The first one regarding Georgia-NATO relationship, not because only I'm from Georgia, but because these countries, I think, have many similarities between them and much in common. And the second one, of course, regarding the Ukraine-NATO relationship. The first one, before the question, I would like to outline several points. First of all, I would like to mention that Georgia is extremely grateful for NATO, for NATO's engagement and efforts and the substantial package it received at Wales summit. But let me be a little bit critical. We all know that, and especially I think that it isn't fair that Georgia hasn't given yet the map, and it isn't truth when we hear that there is no third power that prevents candidate countries entering the alliance and that has right to veto the entry of candidates to NATO. Because if not Russia's fierce resistance, Georgia would have already been a member of NATO. And this, I think it's a serious problem that has to face the international community and NATO, and I'm pretty sure that NATO will overcome this obstacle and this problem, and I think in this regard that NATO, that the United States as a leader should spend more diplomatic resources to convince the countries that have a critical and skeptical stance, like Germany and France, that it's better to have Georgia in rather than to keep it out from alliance, and having Georgia in. The attempts of Russian Federation to get it back to its so-called orbit of exclusive interests would be significantly downed, like it was in the case of Baltic states. And the second point is that we all know that Georgia is the largest known NATO country, a contributor to the operations and missions led by NATO, and the level of preparedness and readiness of Georgian servicemen had been received high assessment of representatives of foreign international forces. And the next last point. I would like to mention that in the past NATO gave a priority to geostrategical and geopolitical considerations in 1952 by admitting, and in 1955 by admitting the countries with both territorial and border problems, and with so-called, just say that insufficient level of democratical development, like Greece, Turkey, and the Federal Republic of Germany. And so the question regarding Georgia-NATO relationship, what else should Georgia do in order to gain the map and subsequently integrate into alliance? And the second question about Ukraine-NATO relationship. How do you think, wouldn't it be the right decision based on geopolitical and geostrategical considerations, like it was in case of Greece, Turkey, and Federal Republic of Germany, to accept Ukraine into NATO, not only based on the strict meeting of requirements and standards of NATO? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Can I perhaps also take the second question, and then I'll get back to the panel?
Thank you. My name's Tim Judah. I'm a journalist from London, and I've been covering the war for the New York Review of Books over the last year or more. Just a quick question, that you mentioned non-lethal weaponry that was being delivered by individual member states, and I was wondering whether the panel think that any renewed major thrust, for example, at Mariupol, but not necessarily at Mariupol, would actually trigger, would actually mean that we kind of go over the line, and in fact that individual countries start to deliver lethal weaponry. I mean, what are people saying in Brussels? What's the thinking on that? And that's basically a question for everyone, I think. Thank you.
All right, so let me perhaps turn back to the panel now. There's a question for NATO map, Georgia, I think that's for you, Jamie. Then there was also the issue about lethal weapons, that's perhaps for the entire panel, but let me perhaps start with you, Jamie, and then go to Ivanna and back to you.
Okay, Bruno, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the questions. It's good to see you here. On Georgia, first of all, we have also, not only with Ukraine, but also with Georgia, significantly upgraded all of our efforts, which were already, frankly, vis-a-vis Georgia, like Ukraine, fairly considerable. For example, we created this category of so-called EOPs, sorry about the acronym, Enhanced Opportunity Partners. There are 5, and Georgia is one of those EOPs with whom we are meeting for consultations very frequently. On the margins of, or as part of foreign ministers' meetings, regularly with the level of ambassadors and so on. Secondly, as you well know, we are setting up a training centre which should be ready by the end of the year, just near Tbilisi, as part of our effort to implement this significant NATO-Georgia defence package that was agreed at the Wales summit. The third thing that we're doing with Georgia is we are continuing very much to work in Afghanistan. You mentioned this in the operations. You're quite right. Georgia has been the largest non-NATO contributor in Afghanistan, and we're very grateful for that. And similar to what I mentioned earlier with Ukraine, involving Georgia in NATO response force, training exercises, very high readiness, the type of things that we're doing in Europe as well. Also, for visibility, as you know, last week the United States conducted off the coast of Georgia a very important naval amphibious exercise. And again, I stress the importance of these allied exercises to demonstrate that this is not somebody else's sphere of influence, that we have a legitimate right to be in the region as well. So there is no neglect whatever for Georgia at the moment. We've been very clear on Ossetia, Abkhazia, the recent treaties that Russia claims to have concluded with these two countries, the borderization issues as well. The Georgian president, by the way, was in Brussels, as you know, just last week, met with the Secretary General as well, and we made it clear, the Secretary General stated this clearly, that no one has any veto on NATO's decision when it comes to enlargement. No droit de regard, no veto. This is a decision that will be taken by NATO alone, and we haven't in any way modified the decision that we made in Bucharest back in 2008 to say that Georgia will be a member of NATO. Now, map. I understand, I hear this, of course, a lot from Georgian colleagues, which is natural. If I were Georgian, I would ask exactly the same question. But what I do want to emphasize is that if you look at Georgia's annual national plan, most of the things in the membership action plan are in that in any case. Now, I agree that symbols, titles, things like map have their value. But what you might also have to know is that much of this preparatory work is being done. You are going through the process in many degrees, even if we're not calling it membership action plan, to such a degree that many of my Georgian diplomatic colleagues say, well, Jamie, we will probably, or can we become members of NATO without going through the membership action plan? For example, you can get married without an engagement ring. Some couples choose to go through engagement before marriage, some choose to go directly for marriage. So there are different routes, of course, and of course many countries of NATO, in NATO today, join the organisation in the past, also without going through a membership action plan. These are ultimately, to be frank with you, these are questions for the allies to decide. But I just want to counter the impression that, because we haven't fixed a date for Georgia to join NATO, or because there isn't the formal endorsement of the membership action plan, that somehow we're stagnant or we're going back. That is really, really not true. We've significantly stepped up our involvement with Georgia. On Ukraine, again, same sort of thing. I'm going to repeat myself, I think, here, but it's a question of going through the same sort of processes. I said at the end of my talk that everything we do has to be in the spirit and the direction of Euro-Atlantic integration that takes us deeper into that process and not away from that process. And I think we recognize that although Armenia, Azerbaijan, for instance, made it clear that this is not the route that they wish to follow, although both Azerbaijan and Armenia wish to remain partner countries of NATO, we hear that very, very strongly, that Georgia and Ukraine are in a different category, and that therefore we can't have the same partnership with these two as we would have for the others as well. So I think that's probably the best I can say there. Now, Tim's question on the non-lethal weapons. Well, I think what I think Russia understands, Tim, is that if there is a major escalation of the fighting directly caused by a deliberate Russian incursion, aggression, then there will be a response. The EU has been looking at extra packages of sanctions. A lot of the legal work to prepare the ground for those has been done in Brussels, similarly with the United States. Once those sanctions are in, as we've seen, they stay. Russia knows, although you hear statements from Russian leaders saying, the sanctions are not having an impact, our economy is getting better. I don't think that's true. I think the sanctions have had an impact, are having an impact. They've certainly worsened the climate of direct investment in Russia, confidence in the Russian economy. And to my mind, what we need to show Russia is that there is a off-ramp, to use a phrase of John Kerry, there is a form of de-escalation. If Russia comes back into compliance with international law, we are not the people who are escalating here. We're not seeking any kind of provocation. It's Russia which has been provoking and escalating. But, there is a way out of the woods if Russia wants to seize that. Nothing is inevitable about confrontation. But that if Russia pushes it further, then obviously there will be some kind of response. Now, on the lethal weapons, again, this is in the hands of the Allies, but you follow the debate in the US Congress, obviously, very, very carefully. So all I can say is that without speculating on what the response would be, the key thing is I think Russia knows that there would be a response. We are ready to push it to the next level if that's what we have to do. But we're also ready, hopefully, to de-escalate if that is what Russia has to do. But the choice is with Mr. Putin, first and foremost. Lengthy answer. Who else on this one? Please. You have your own microphone, which is...
I can share this with you.
A parliamentarian should have her own microphone.
Thank you, Tim, for the question. I would really want to make sure that we do not have to wait and experience another military offensive in order for our partners in the West to actually clearly understand that this is that red line that they cannot afford to Russia to cross and then step in with the non-lethal or lethal weapons. So again, I would like to go back to one of the points I made at the very beginning. We are for the diplomatic, political way of de-escalation, of stabilization, and then hopefully reintegration of the territory into united and unified Ukraine with decentralization on its way. But we wouldn't want to just to spare the opportunity to make sure that we are already prepared now to meet the military offensive if it comes in. So we would like our colleagues and our partners in the West to hear their arguments and to see the reality and to step in already now to help us be prepared to defend in order to de-escalate if it's acceptable.
Well, I wanted just to add to what has already been mentioned, that it is very important to keep that signal that the lethal weapons could be delivered, even if they won't be delivered if, in case of possible Russian offensive. And as any revisionist, Putin is a risk taker, but maximizing his possible risks is still an important part of any strategy of dealing with him.
All right, thank you for your reactions. There's one more question. Gentleman there.
Yeah, hello. Paul Larsen, I'm correspondent with the Danish daily Jyllandsposten. I have two quick questions. First, I mean, speaking about NATO, I assume there's a perspective of Ukraine actually joining the alliance at some point. Obviously, this is some way off, but what kind of time frame are we talking about? Are we talking about 3 years? Are we talking 5 years? Are we talking 10 years? Could we be a bit more specific on that, at least sort of in the realm of expectations? The second question, we saw over the weekend the European Union putting on a somewhat lukewarm Eastern Partnership summit in Riga. Is NATO seen in Ukraine as a more forthcoming international partner for the country than the European Union at this point?
All right, thanks for your question. So first, can we stick to a timeline for Ukraine membership? And then secondly, is there a priority and importance between EU and NATO?
Thank you. All the questions are very good today. On the timetable, the honest answer is I don't know. All bureaucrats hate saying I don't know, but it's the only honest, truthful answer because there is no answer. In other words, you're asking me to give you an answer which does not exist. So what you're actually asking me to do is to speculate or make something up, which, having been invented by me, would have minimum, not even minimum, I mean zero validity, because again, it's not Jamie Shea who takes that decision. It's the 28 NATO allies. And my sense, again, is, particularly in the current crisis, let's not waste our time and energy on the things over which we have currently, no control. Let's use all of our time on energy on the things over which we can have some influence and control, which is all of these practical assistance and other measures, which again take us in the right direction in any case. And at the risk of being a bit boring, I have to repeat what I said. What we have to do is make sure that all of the things we do tie Ukraine closer to Brussels, both the EU side and the NATO side, increase the links, increase the the synergy, the common values, the interdependence, and everything, so that Ukraine becomes, if you like, a sort of NATO-type country. I choose my words carefully, or an EU-type country. Before it, the question of membership happens. And, the more Ukraine looks European, sounds European, feels European, acts European, the more people will say, well, of course, obviously, why not? How could we have ever thought that this could be in doubt? And a lot of that lies in the hands of Ukraine. So when it comes to a date, don't just look for the answer in Brussels. The date will be determined as much in Kiev as it will in Brussels. And if Kiev can influence the date, by the way it acts. Again, not a very sexy answer, but it's the only honest answer, because at the moment there is no answer to that particular question. But we know what we have to do. Ukraine knows what it has to do, and just do it is the key thing. On the NATO being more forthcoming, no, I wouldn't say that. I mean, the EU, for example, in Riga last week, agreed a substantial, I think, 1.8 billion euros substantial financial package, economic assistance, 200 million euros, if I got the statistics right, in immediate sort of technical assistance and facilitation. The EU, the IMF are working very closely on the overall debt reduction financial support package. The IMF 17 billion. The EU has agreed a package, I think, of 11 billion euros. I mean, this is serious money, particularly at a time when the EU is facing considerable threats from migration, Libya, the south, the explosive Middle Eastern situation. The EU is running a lot of talks, technical advisory teams, and so on here. Indeed, its assets are much greater than the trust funds that we were talking about in the NATO context. What NATO has, of course, is a NATO-Ukraine Commission. In other words, an institution, a body, a council for NATO and Ukraine to work together in a way that is not quite the same way with the European Union, so maybe we've sort of institutionalized the relationship somewhat more. We, of course, also have had the benefit of sizable Ukrainian contingents participating in our military operations, notably Afghanistan, but also the Balkans before that, the maritime assets, in a way which perhaps has not quite yet been true of the CSDP, the Common Security and Defense Policy operations, although Ukraine has shown some interest there in terms of trainers and advisors. So we have had this sort of deeper involvement, but you have to remember that for a long time Ukraine's aspiration was to join the EU but not NATO, a situation which has been changed by the vote in the Rada last year, and public supporting Ukraine for EU membership until recently, correct me if I'm wrong, was much greater than for NATO membership. I think that it's still greater. Yeah, it's still. I think essentially to be honest, again, you know this already, the EU is a more complicated organisation than NATO. I mean, to join, you have to go through these 36 chapters with hundreds of thousands of pages of detailed legislation, adaptation in every field of life. This is not as intrusive, of course, in NATO. But most countries, I mean, not everybody, but most countries ultimately have found that Euro-Atlantic integration means being part of both. And the two tracks go along similar lines. The reforms that countries undertake to join NATO obviously are also of interest to the EU, and of course vice versa. We may work on different parts of the body, if I can use this analogy. NATO may be firming up the neck and the soldier muscles, and the EU firming up the legs and the hips or whatever. But the reforms clearly are to the benefit of the integration process in the other organisation as well.
Ivanna, Jamie doesn't know the timeline of Ukraine membership, but perhaps you know the answer.
No, I don't think that I will be having breaking news on that timeline that you're asking about. But, there are some internal documents here in Ukraine, like coalition agreement in the parliament, where we have set some of the, benchmarks for ourselves. When does Ukraine have to implement the NATO standards in this or that sphere, and I think, if I remember correctly, it's 2018, 19, and 20. So this is the internal benchmarks that we have been already setting for ourselves. Does it mean that before that or after that Ukraine will apply for NATO membership, or it will be ready earlier than that or later than that? I cannot predict, and I think it's it's quite a speculation also, considering the fact that we have a very difficult and unpredictable neighbor and situation we are finding ourselves in. So even with all the devotion and work and mobilization, internal mobilization to do the reform might not work out if we and our Western partners will not make sure that the next military offensive is not happening, for example. And with regard to your estimate of the Eastern Partnership Summit in Riga, Eastern Partnership is not exclusively focused on Ukraine. That's why it's Eastern Partnership of the EU with 6 countries, and they all have their own, pace, interests, ambitions, and I think that in considering all of that and the division and diversion we had experienced in the last couple of years between the ambitions and plans of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, as opposed to Belarus, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, I think the Eastern Partnership has reached even more than it could have reached in this specific summit. And as opposed to perception, to NATO and EU perception here, with regard to NATO and EU perception here, I think the basic line would be the difference in perception is that we all understand and we already see that, the huge and burdening EU bureaucracy makes EU not that efficient in quick responses. And so far it's seen that NATO, just by the goals and its main ideas and its main aims, right, has to be more efficient in responding and faster in responding and maybe even more flexible in responding to the challenges. So I think this is the basic division that we see right now in reactions, and not necessarily who is more forthcoming or who is less supportive or anything like that. It's more about the institution and the instruments that they have at hand to work with partners.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, at the German March Fund we take the word German very seriously, so we will finish on time. And there's also a delicious lunch waiting for us downstairs, so I don't want to stop us from that. Now, so let me conclude by one more question to the panel, and your answer in 2-3 sentences. Getting back to the theme of this event, strengthening the NATO-Ukraine partnership, what is now the #1 priority to do? if you could, in 2-3 sentences.
God, I have trouble saying anything in 2 or 3 sentences, but it's a good discipline. No, I think 2 things. NATO has to take a strategic, long-term geopolitical view of Ukraine beyond the immediate partnership and in view of the fundamental importance of Ukraine to European security. That's 1 sentence, very long. Ukraine, on the other hand, has to prove its seriousness and credibility through implementing everything we agree. So top down for NATO, bottom up for Kiev.
I would just subscribe to that. I don't think that we have to find the new will here. And long-lasting, that's probably also the key for NATO approach, that it's not a year or year and a half or 2 years. It has to be time framed for the future, not specifically for the nearest hectic or difficult period.
Shortly getting back to our 6 recommendations. Making Ukraine more effective, this is a task for Ukrainians, and building up a strategy towards regional security, this is a common task, and to look for a place for Ukraine in it.
All right. Well, let me just thank the speakers for your marvelous contribution and straightforward thoughts. I think this really was an opportunity to give us a good overview of the issues at stake and the challenges ahead, and I'm sure there will be more time downstairs to perhaps dig deeper into what we discussed. Let me also thank you to be here with us today. Let me thank the digital viewers as well. And we are, at least at our side, look very much forward to a next event in the future and coming back here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.